Welcome to another episode edition of the Tai Luntan, the Tai Initiative's online video forum. Today we have as our honored guest David Firestein, founder and director of the new China Public Policy Center at the University of Texas. David, welcome.
Carson, thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to continue our discussion about subnational relations by talking to David about what he's seeing, learning, and doing in helping make the great state of Texas a real player in the US-America-China relationship. Texas is a big state. It's got a lot of big money, a lot of big power, a lot of big visions, and it is no stranger to America-China relations. There are plenty of sister city relations and other things going on in Texas. Nevertheless, as one who watches America-China relations, Texas does not loom large on the horizon of real players in a centralized, coordinated fashion. And now we hope to see possibly some of that environment changing with David's leadership. So David, with that little bit of introduction about what it is we're talking about today, we'd love to hear from you about what is going on in Texas, not with regards to grassroots specifics, but with regards to how you see an opportunity for the state to play a role in helping Americans and Chinese think new about how to relate to one another.
Well, Carson, thanks so much. And it's an honor to be with you. And I'm a big admirer of the work of the Tai Initiative and delighted to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts on a really important topic, which is how Texas and more broadly different regions within the United States engage China in ways that are mutually beneficial. And right now here, sitting on the University of Texas campus in the heart of Austin, Texas, I'm looking at everything through very much a Texas lens and seeing both some opportunities and some challenges that I had not been as close to in the earlier elements of my career as a U.S. diplomat or U.S. think tank executive. And now it's a really neat set of issues to have the opportunity to work on. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the Texas-China opportunity, if I can put it that way, is that Texas is actually a massive economy that would rank number 10 in the world among a list of national economies. So when we talk about Texas, we're talking about a state, but we're also talking about an economy that is the 10th ranking economy in the world. And of course, when we talk about China, we're talking about the number 2 economy. And so just between China and Texas alone as a state, you have a trade relationship that is a top 10 trade relationship in the world. That is a remarkable and striking piece of information. And to me, it suggests both the promise of the work relating to how Texas can deal with China, but also some of the challenges that are out there. Because as I look at the Texas-China relationship, notwithstanding the heft and power of both sides of that equation, both China on the one hand and Texas on the other, I think there is a lot of unrealized potential. And to put it a different way, a lot of upside potential in the Texas-China dynamic that we haven't seen fully given expression to yet. But very much as you noted in your very kind prefatory remarks, we have an opportunity now at the University of Texas China Public Policy Center at the LBJ School of Public Affairs right here in Austin to change that dynamic and actually work to advance Texas-China and U.S.-China relations in ways that I think are quite distinct. And if I can use a University of Texas metaphor, we want to put a burnt orange imprint or coloration onto our China policy agenda to make it highly differentiated relative to other very good work that's going on across the country, and to really fully leverage the opportunities associated with the LBJ School as a school, the University of Texas as a world-level university, Austin as a great city and driver of technological advancement, and the United States and Texas itself, as well as the United States. So we feel a great sense of promise, a great sense of opportunity, and I personally couldn't be more excited than I am to be a small part of that here in Austin.
Well, that's great. It's fun to hear about the burnt orange imprint. I hope that that color is somewhat reasonably close to the burnt orange color you might see as our branding on our own logo at
There's a striking similarity, Carson.
Now, David, we know that you haven't been in operations very long. It's been less than a year, but we also know that there's been so much taking up your time that it's been hard to even know kind of where the CPPC is specifically headed with what you're accomplishing, et cetera. So perhaps you could give us some idea of the ways in which education and what students can learn about state relations as being different than national relations has any play in what you're learning and doing.
Well, it's a great question. And, one of the things that I've seen both from a federal perspective as a former federal government official and civil servant, foreign service officer, and then now from a state perspective as a state of Texas employee and as a proud Texan, a native-born Texan, there is a pretty significant distinction in divergence in the perspectives of the federal government and state and local governments when it comes to China. Through the federal lens, what we're seeing more and more from U.S. Political leaders and some of their statements and in congressional hearings and so on, and also in news articles about China, is a very highly adversarial framing of China as the mortal enemy of the United States for all eternity. And it's a striking and stunning evolution in the narrative about China, and looked at through a federal lens, at least in some quarters. There are some voices, and it's not unanimous, but there are some voices that frame China in this extraordinary adversarial way. But states and governors and cities and their mayors, and state legislators who care about what's happening in Texas or in Washington State or Tennessee or anywhere else across the country tend to look at China through a very different prism. Mostly they're looking at China as a critically important partner in an economic, trade, and investment and business sense. They look at China not through the prism of the South China Sea or North Korean Peninsula diplomacy, but rather through the lens of the possibility of mutually beneficial economic engagement, job creating investment, and similar types of lenses. So I think there's a very sharp distinction between how some in the federal government, whether it's in the executive or legislative branch, look at China on the one hand, versus how governors of states, how state legislators, how state offices of economic development and tourism and so forth and so on, how they look at the picture. And when you look at Texas, there are a few. I'll give you a few data points that really stand out that suggest why state level folks look at the relationship very differently than federal folks. So I mentioned that Texas is a top 10 economy and the second largest U.S. state economy behind only California. And we'll catch California at some point in the near future. That's certainly my hope and aspiration. But here's a couple of other interesting data points. China is the number one source of imports, foreign imports, into the state of Texas. Now, when you think about that, that means China outpaces Canada and Mexico. And in fact, if you look at the most recent official data on the issue of Texas-China trade, China's imports into Texas is almost as great as imports from Canada and Mexico combined. Now, these are two countries that
is remarkable, especially for the state of Texas, which you would assume and consider huge in its Mexican relations.
And no question about it. And exactly as you note, that is a remarkable and really, in my judgment, a shocking fact. Think about this. Just as you mentioned, Carson, Mexico is a wonderful neighbor of Texas, and there's a huge amount of trade. Canada, of course, is a neighbor that shares a long, long border with the United States, and there's a huge amount of goodwill and trade that crosses that border. And both Canada and Mexico are in NAFTA. So notwithstanding the neighboring geography and notwithstanding that this is a free trade area, NAFTA, it's the NAFTA zone, China still outpaces both of those countries combined, just about. That's where we are right now on imports. Meanwhile, China is the number 3 destination for Texas exports to the world. And it's behind only Mexico and Canada, and it will soon gain on and probably overtake number 2. Down the line, it could very well overtake both and become the number 1 destination for Texas exports as well. Now, let me just mention a couple of other things. I won't go on and on, but these are some facts that I think show how significant China can be to a state economy. A couple of data points. There's a county in Texas, up in north central Texas, that is the #1 pecan producing county in the state of Texas, and probably one of the greatest producers of pecans in the world. Their #1 market is China. So here's a little rural county in Texas, and they have a bunch of pecan trees, and they produce a lot of great pecans, which is the state nut of Texas. And where does it go? To China disproportionately. Meanwhile,
you happen to know what percentage? They're the largest receiver, but do you happen to know what proportion of the crop goes?
I don't know. I don't know the exact data, but I just heard that from someone in the county that's involved in that industry, and okay. I intend to look it up because it's one of
here in Washington State. There's growers out in Eastern Washington for whom at least 80% of the crop leaves and goes to China. Almost everything you produce. So
no question about it. And Texas is also a big agricultural state in a number of different ways, and a lot of our produce goes to China. But let me also make a broader point. Texas is the #1 exporting state in the United States of America, and a large and disproportionate amount of those exports go to China. But take the case of Laredo, a border town right on the U.S. border, the Texas border with Mexico, and obviously Mexico is the #1 trading partner of Laredo, but guess who's #2? China. And this is not even a coastal city. So you can see the impact of China as an economic player, trade partner, business partner, investment partner with the state of Texas, not just in Austin, the capital, or Houston, the sort of financial capital and powerhouse of the state, but even in a town like Laredo. And yet, with all of that, I think we still have an underexploited opportunity from which both Americans, including Texans, and Chinese can benefit. And we want to be a big part of that equation as we push forward this really important bilateral state-to-country relationship in the case of Texas-China.
That's all wonderful. Thank you, David. Now, as we move toward the end of our time, is all of this kind of, in a sense, just the money? Or is there also an element that you've seen in Texas with regards to a community in Texas that says, we're trying to be understood and to understand Chinese culture and perspective? And do you see any evidence that Texas has received any kind of, I'll call it a social understanding or a social goal on the part of China? Or is it really just money?
Well, it's a good question. And certainly the entirety of what you call the America-China relationship is very multifaceted. The business piece of that is an enormously important component, but it's not the entirety of that relationship. Likewise, for any given state, there are different elements, and it's true for Texas as a big state, important and politically powerful state. I do think that the business, trade, and investment piece of the interaction and engagement between Texas and China is probably the dominant piece. It is probably the dominant lens through which most of Texas thinks about China, to the degree that they think about China, folks here in the state. That said, there are also other components that are really important to the way that Texas engages China. So, for example, the #1 source of students, foreign students at the University of Texas at both the graduate and the undergraduate levels is China. And counted separately, Taiwan, so mainland China is #1 for both graduates and undergraduates. Taiwan is #4 for both graduates and undergraduates. Certainly, if you add those two together, it's an even more prominent presence, if you will, from Greater China. So already China plays an outsized role at the flagship university of the state of Texas, namely the University of Texas, Austin. It plays a really important role at Texas A&M, another extraordinary university in the state, and at Rice University and universities across the great state of Texas, Baylor, and others. So the student-to-student, professor-to-professor, visiting scholar to visiting scholar relationship, all of those are really important pieces. And as you noted at the outset, sister cities, sister provinces, sister states, there are linkages there that I think go beyond just the business deal and signing the contract for whatever good or service. So I think there is a holistic sense in this state and a growing sense in this state of how important China can be to the future of Texas, particularly given the threefold Texas sort of trifecta of prosperity, which is the technology sector, agriculture, and perhaps above all, energy. So I think Texas feels the opportunity and senses the vastness of the opportunity, maybe more than most states in this country.
All right, great. David, one final question, a bit off topic here, but thinking about leadership, because that's what TIE Initiative is always trying to teach in people and to engender more and more of. Give us a quick thought, if you can, just shooting from the hip, about what in the career world of working in U.S.-China relations are some of what's one or two key skills that young people ought to be thinking about developing in their own way of working, in their own way of leadership of themselves or others, to help them become powerful participants in this relationship?
Well, it's a great question. And let me first of all say very genuinely, Carson, that I personally greatly admire the work of the TIE Initiative in the leadership piece of this relationship. I think you have been personally, and the organization has been a leader in this area. I think a lot more work needs to be done. And I salute you and your organization, the TIE Initiative, for the great work that you do. I would say pioneering work that you do in this area. For me, as you ask me about this, the thing that I think I keep coming back to from a U.S. perspective as we try to deal as Americans with China is that there's a really, we can't overlook the profundity of the difference in culture down to the core civilizational level between our countries. And we have to, as Americans dealing with China, really seek to understand the culture that we are dealing with, even if what we're trying to do is sign a deal for $4 billion worth of wind turbines or $6 billion worth of soybean exports or whatever. Underneath all of that, it really matters, I think, and it can make a difference if a person understands the cultural context in which they're operating, not just at a sort of China 101 level, but at a very deep cultural and civilizational level that goes to the sources of why China thinks about the world the way that it does, and how that thought pattern and thought process differs from ours in this country. And I think the people that I know that have been the most successful leaders in the U.S.-China field are people that really grasp, as I know that you, Carson, and the TIE Initiative do grasp and understand, the deeper sources of difference and divergence in our cultural and civilizational traditions. And I think it's really important to do that without any judgments attached to it, but just as a way of understanding the differences. And once you understand those differences, a lot of things that may not make sense about China to the average American start to make more sense, even if you disagree with the underlying norm or the underlying policy. And I think that notion of really going to the heart of the issue, getting to the cultural and civilizational level, I think is really important. And I'll just give you one example so that this becomes less abstract. And I've talked about this in some of my talks. I think both the United States and China have a kind of dualism in their national psyche, but the dualisms are very different. So in the case of the United States, our dualism is one informed by the Bible and one informed by the Old Testament and the notion of good and evil. So we as Americans, almost genetically coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition that we come from, tend to think of the world as fitting into categories of good or evil. And you hear that in the comments of U.S. presidents and U.S. political leaders of both parties. This is not a partisan thing. When we talk about the axis of what? The axis of evil. When we talk about you're either with us or you're against us, we tend to think in starkly moral terms. That's because of Adam and Eve and the apple. And that's because there was the notion of you can choose to do good, you can choose to do evil, and so forth and so on. It goes back to the genetic beginnings, if you will, of the Judeo-Christian civilizational tradition. China comes at its dualism in a very, very different way.
Indeed.
The Chinese dualism is a dualism of, and I'm using a word from the name of your organization, I think, or was implied by that, the yin and yang, sort of the notion of um, there are two forces in the world. There are forces in one direction and forces in the other, but one is not better than the other. You need both. You can't not have either one. They're morally equivalent, and they're both part of the same organic whole. So it is. So whereas we have a dualism of superiority and inferiority, China has a dualism of equivalence. What that leads to is that we see the world in highly moralistic terms and judgmental terms, and China sees the world in terms of I'm okay, you're okay. Don't mess with me, I won't mess with you. Leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. Don't impose your values on me, I won't impose your values on you. And their fundamental dualism leads them to a very different way of organizing their society and thinking about their place in the world. Without needing to say which dualism is right or wrong, the point that I make is that those two dualisms are fundamentally different. And if we don't understand those differences at a very fundamental level, we're never going to be able to solve the problems that seem like they're vexing problems, but that are actually symptoms of a much deeper and more fundamental divergence in our civilizations. That's why culture matters. That's why the work of the Thai Initiative matters. And I don't think it's a word in your title, but I think you do use the symbol, if I'm not mistaken, of the kind of the yin yang dynamic. And it really is important to understand things at that level if you want to be ultimately effective in dealing across the cultural divide. That's true in the other direction as well. But speaking from an American perspective, I think our nation has a long way to go generally in understanding who we're dealing with. And I think it's worth the investment because China is going to be, is now, and is going to be the most important partner, bilateral partner of the United States for the next couple of 100 years. And so any investment that we make as a nation in understanding this relationship and understanding the dynamics of it at a deep level, I think is time well invested. Okay, I think we got cut off.
Very well said.